Late February 1945. The east bank of the Ruhr River in western Germany. A German artillery observer stood in the damp dark of a concrete pillbox. The second the barrage lifted, the surviving defenders would emerge from their deep dugouts. They would man the heavy machine guns, sight their mortars, locate the enemy pillbox on his standardized topographical map, and estimate its grid coordinates. He spoke a concise, highly disciplined sequence of words into the handset. He identified his unit, gave the map coordinates of the German position, described the target as an active bunker, and requested fire. That transmission did not go to a single, isolated battery commander standing blindly on a distant hill. The American military had woven an invisible electronic net over the entire battlefield. The observer's voice flew back across the river, over the German defenses, and straight into the headphones of an operator sitting in a dimly lit canvas tent miles behind the front line. The forward observer had solved the problem of sight. He had given the heavy artillery a pair of eyes directly inside the chaotic, moving perimeter of the bridgehead. But sight alone does not move a steel howitzer barrel. The observer's frantic transmission was nothing more than a voice reciting a map coordinate. To save the infantry bleeding on the riverbank, that abstract location had to be translated into exact elevation dials and deflection angles for dozens of distinct cannons, all sitting in different geographic locations in a matter of seconds. A voice in a radio could not do that. It required a centralized brain. The voice from the riverbank crackled through the speaker of a large canvas tent 3 miles away, and slaughter the slow-moving boats in the open water. It was a mathematical certainty. Then, the first wave of canvas and wood boats hit the water. Inside, there was no mud, no incoming fire, and no panicked rushing. A gasoline generator hummed steadily outside. The Fire Direction Center, or FDC, operated with the quiet, focused intensity of an accounting office. Men sat at folding wooden tables under bare light bulbs, wearing heavy radio headsets, holding grease pencils and specialized rulers. This was the centralized analog brain of the American artillery. Before the invention of the FDC, calculating firing data was slow because every battery commander acted as an independent mathematician, doing his own trigonometry on a windy hill. The FDC removed the math from the battlefield entirely. All the complex, time-consuming variables of heavy gunnery, the morning barometric pressure, the temperature of the propellant powders stacked outside, the exact millimeter of wear on the rifling of each specific gun barrel, had been measured and factored into their charts hours before the infantry ever approached the water. When the forward observer's requested grid coordinate came through the radio, the men in the tent did not need to start from scratch. A soldier called a plotter immediately located the grid reference and pressed a steel pin into a massive, heavily marked master map known as the firing chart. Next to him, enlisted men, officially designated as computers, wielded a simple but revolutionary analog tool, a graphical firing scale. It looked like a curved, translucent plastic fan. The silence never came. Instead, the barrage mutated. 2 miles upwind of the crossing site, a specific cluster of shells slammed into the riverbank. By placing the pivot point of the fan on the gun battery's surveyed location on the map and swinging the curved edge directly over the newly placed target pin, the computer physically bypassed the complex equations. The plastic scale instantly translated the geographic distance into the exact elevation and deflection angles required for the cannons. What previously took a field officer several minutes with a slide rule and paper tables now took a trained enlisted man roughly 15 seconds. As soon as the numbers were read off the plastic scale, a telephone operator relayed them down thick copper wires directly to the waiting gun crews. The men standing beside the howitzers did not need to know what they were shooting at. They did not need to see the river. They simply turned their steel dials to the shouted numbers, loaded the shell, and pulled the lanyard. The true power of the FDC was not just speed, it was scale. Because the center controlled multiple batteries, it acted as a massive switchboard for destruction. An officer standing over the firing chart could look at the pin representing the active German bunker, recognize the immediate threat to the fragile bridgehead, and decide that 4 howitzers were not enough. Without needing to consult higher headquarters or ask for permission, they did not explode with the dark, grey smoke of high explosives. They burst with the brilliant, searing flash of white phosphorus. The FDC officer could issue firing data to 3 separate batteries at once. 12 heavy guns, sitting in completely different geographical locations, across miles of obscured countryside, could instantly pivot, elevate, and drop their combined payload onto a target the size of a living room. The FDC had compressed the lag between an infantryman's plea for help and a heavy artillery strike from hours down to seconds. It had turned cumbersome industrial machinery into a highly responsive, tactical weapon. Yet, surviving the Roer River crossing required more than just dropping high explosives. To keep the fragile canvas boats moving, the infantry needed a protective curtain that could blind the enemy, suppress their trenches, and destroy their concrete bunkers simultaneously. The FDC had mastered the math of coordinates, but how did it manage a complex, shifting symphony of different chemical and explosive shells while avoiding the American troops trapped in the narrow bridgehead? Down at the gun pits, the mathematical solutions from the Fire Direction Center translated instantly into heavy physical labor. A voice crackled out of a field. Telephone strapped to a wooden post. Fire mission. Battery A, shell white phosphorus. Battery B, shell high explosive. Fuse time. In older, rigid command structures, changing ammunition types in the middle of a creeping barrage caused catastrophic delays. The wind caught the thick, dense smoke and dragged an impenetrable white curtain directly across the face of the German positions. The defenders were instantly blinded. The gun crews had to stop, consult new ballistic tables for the different weights of the shells, and reset their aiming points. The American FDC treated ammunition the same way a switchboard operator treated phone lines. The men in the canvas tent simply applied a different ballistic overlay. On their maps, calculated the new trajectory and sent the updated numbers down the wire. This allowed a single officer in the tent to orchestrate a complex, multi-layered attack simultaneously. When the forward observer crouching in the mud of the riverbank spotted a concrete pillbox flanked by an open trench line, he did not just ask for explosions. He asked for a tailored solution. The FDC instantly split the workload across the dispersed batteries. They assigned a battery of heavy 155mm guns to fire armor-piercing shells with delay fuses, designed to bury themselves deep into the concrete pillbox before detonating. At the exact same moment, they ordered a battery of lighter 105mm howitzers to fire white phosphorus to blind the adjacent German observation post. They assigned a third battery to fire high explosive shells equipped with mechanical time fuses, calibrated to detonate exactly 30 feet in the air over the open trench. To the German defenders on the receiving end, the result was a perfectly coordinated nightmare. It was not a random bombardment. It was a curated environment of destruction. Brilliant flashes of white phosphorus erupted along the shoreline, instantly throwing up thick, heavy pillars of smoke that merged into a solid white wall. The observer listened. The American heavy guns had not stopped firing. They had merely changed their rhythm. When the wind shifted and began to blow the smoke away from the crossing boats, the forward observer simply thumbed his radio. Right 100, drop 50. Inside the FDC, the plotter moved his pin, the computer swung his plastic scale, and new numbers went down the wire. Within 45 seconds, The wall of smoke physically stepped to the right, adjusting to the wind and keeping the boats hidden. Blind but desperate, the German infantry in the trenches fired their rifles into the smoke. Instantly, the airburst shells arrived. The mechanical fuses detonated the high explosive above their heads, driving a lethal shower of jagged steel splinters downward into the dirt trenches. The defenders were forced to press their faces into the mud to survive, effectively suppressing their fire. The American artillery never paused to calculate. A single battery could transition from building a smokescreen to crushing a mortar pit simply because a loader unscrewed a point-detonating fuse with an iron wrench, screwed on a time fuse, and shoved a different-colored steel cylinder into the breach. By removing the rigid timetable, the FDC allowed the artillery to react to the brutal physical friction of the water. If an assault boat snagged on submerged debris and the infantry stalled, the barrage did not blindly roll forward and abandon them. The forward observer held the protective roof of shrapnel and the wall of smoke in place. The guns waited on the infantry. When a German machine gun blindly opened fire through the smoke, hoping to hit a boat, the American artillery responded in less than 90 seconds. Under this shifting, customized canopy, the first American boots finally hit the eastern mud. They scrambled up the bank and began digging a shallow, fragile perimeter. They had defeated the direct line of sight, but the shoreline machine guns were only the first layer of the German defense. As the bridgehead formed, a far heavier threat woke up. German artillery batteries, safely camouflaged in ravines miles behind the lines, began receiving their own orders to annihilate the crossing. The American smokescreen could block a rifleman's vision, but it could not stop a heavy artillery shell plunging from the sky. To protect the men on the riverbank, the American system now had to find and destroy invisible guns it could not see. The American infantryman scraping a shallow trench into the eastern bank of the Roar River heard the tearing whistle of incoming heavy artillery. Seconds later, geysers of mud and brown water erupted along the shoreline. The wall of white phosphorus smoke masking the crossing was entirely useless against this new threat. The German artillery commanders hidden 3 miles away in the hills did not need a visual line of sight. They had spent weeks registering their 105mm and 150mm guns on the riverbank. They knew the exact map coordinates of the mud where the Americans were now digging. All they had to do was dial in the pre-calculated numbers and pull the lanyard. In the brutal math of a river crossing, a tight, localized volley of high explosives crashed directly onto the active machine gun nest, erasing it. The attacker's artillery must silence the defender's guns, or the fragile bridgehead will be shelled into a graveyard. Historically, counter-battery fire was a slow, agonizing guessing game. Armies relied on men listening to the distant boom of cannons and trying to triangulate the sound, or watching the horizon for a brief muzzle flash. It often took days to locate an enemy battery. By the time return fire was organized, the enemy had usually moved. But the American Fire Direction Center had modernized the counter-battery fight, linking its centralized brain to a new set of eyes positioned far above the battlefield. Hovering at 2,000 feet, a fragile, canvas-skinned L-4 grasshopper spotting plane circled through the gray sky. The pilot and the observer inside had no armor, no weapons, and a top speed of barely 85 miles per hour. Yet, German anti-aircraft gunners were ordered to shoot them down at all costs, and German artillery crews dreaded the sight of them. The observer in the tiny plane held an FM radio handset connected directly to the FDC switchboard. From his altitude, the camouflage netting hiding the German guns was useless. The moment a German battery fired, the observer saw the brilliant orange stab of the muzzle flash against the dark winter landscape. At the same time, miles behind the American lines, mobile radar units pointed their parabolic dish antennas. The barrage was walking just yards ahead of the crossing infantry, suppressing the shoreline, hunting active threats, and sealing off the flanks toward the German positions. Originally designed to track aircraft, the operators had learned to tilt the antennas downward. When a German shell crested its trajectory, the radar pulse caught it in mid-air. An analog computer traced the parabolic arc backward in real time, pinpointing the exact piece of Earth the shell had left. The German artillerymen firing blindly into the river crossing believed they were safe in their rear echelon sanctuaries. They were not. They were instantly caught in an electronic net. Inside the fire direction center, the telephone rang. Coordinates arrived simultaneously from the spotting plane and the radar trucks. The plotter drove a pin into the master map. The FDC officer did not bother with the light 105mm guns. For counter-battery fire, he reached for the heaviest weapons on the board, the massive 155mm and 8-inch howitzers. The calculation took less than a minute. The heavy batteries received the data, loaded 200-pound projectiles, and fired. The German gunners had barely ejected their spent brass casings before the sky above them tore open. The American response was devastating, precise, and immediate. The counter-battery fire shattered the German cannons, ignited their stacked ammunition, and permanently silenced the threat to the riverbank. The FDC had successfully shielded the assault boats and crushed the long-range artillery. By noon, the American infantry had carved out a mile-wide bridgehead. But a bridgehead is only a temporary foothold. It was not a pre-planned script running its course. It was reacting to the battle in real time. To the German observer looking through the slit, it is a mass of lightly armed men cut off from their own tanks by a rushing river. The German command recognized the crisis. They knew that artillery alone could not push the Americans back into the water. They needed steel, tracks, and momentum. Hidden in the forests beyond the Ruhr, a concentrated force of German armor fueled up and began moving toward the river. The FDC could hit a stationary bunker and silence a firing cannon. The question was whether its network could react fast enough to stop a massive, mobile, armored counterattack before it overran the thin line of mud. The rumble began deep in the woods. To the American infantry clinging to the muddy bridgehead, it was a terrifying sound. It was the high-pitched squeal of unlubricated steel tracks and the low, guttural roar of heavy Maybach engines. German panzers and armored half-tracks were massing just beyond the tree line, preparing to counterattack. The Americans on the eastern bank had no tanks of their own. The river behind them was still too fast and too wide for heavy pontoon bridges. The infantry had only rifles, a few bazookas, and their entrenching tools. If the German armor breached the thin perimeter, the bridgehead would be erased, and the survivors would be driven back into the freezing Ruhr, watching the opposite shore through a narrow viewing slit. The water below him was cold, violent, and swollen from sabotaged dams. This defied the physical limits of warfare. Miles away, hidden behind hills and forests, were dozens of separate American artillery batteries. In a shallow foxhole, the forward observer raised his binoculars. He saw the grey hulls shifting in the shadows of the pines. He picked up his radio handset. He did not ask for a single battery. He transmitted the coordinates of the forming armor and requested a divisional fire mission. 3 miles away, the fire direction center received the call. The officer standing over the master map understood the physics of an armored assault. If he ordered a standard artillery barrage, the scattered batteries would fire as soon as they received the data. Their shells would arrive in a staggered, ragged sequence. The very first explosion, even if it missed, would act as an alarm. The German tank commanders would instantly close their steel hatches. The infantry would dive into craters. By the time the rest of the heavy shells arrived, the enemy would be shielded under armor and earth. To break a massed counterattack, The FDC needed to deliver maximum destruction in the single second before the enemy knew they were under fire. They executed a procedure known as time on target. Time on target was the ultimate expression of the centralized brain. The goal was to have every shell from every cannon hit the exact same grid coordinate at the exact same millisecond. By every known military standard, those scattered guns should have been isolated, blind, and chained to their paper schedules. To achieve this, the FDC did not order the guns to fire at the same time. The batteries were scattered across miles of terrain. A heavy projectile fired from a 155-millimeter gun 5 miles away had a much longer flight time than a shell fired from a 105-millimeter howitzer only 2 miles away. Instead, the men in the canvas tent calculated the precise time of flight for each specific battery based on its geographic location. Then, they worked backward from a synchronized stopwatch. They broadcast a strict, staggered firing schedule down the field telephones. The heaviest guns, positioned furthest in the rear, fired first. Their massive projectiles began their long parabolic arc through the clouds. Several seconds later, the medium guns fired. Finally, the light howitzers positioned closest to the river pulled their lanyards. In the woods near the bridgehead, the German tank crews heard nothing. There were no ranging shots. There was no preliminary whistle. The shells were converging from different altitudes and angles, traveling faster than the speed of sound. At the designated second, the sky simply collapsed. Dozens of high-explosive shells, fired from completely different locations at completely different times, struck the tree line simultaneously. The result was not a series of explosions. It was a single, localized earthquake. The sheer concussive force of the synchronized detonation flipped half-tracks, coordinating them to shift targets instantly, switch ammunition types on the fly, and weave a protective net around moving infantry should have taken hours of mathematical calculation, shattered the optical glass on the panzers, and crushed the infantry caught in the open. Before the German commanders could react, the FDC triggered a second, time on target, volley, then a third. The armored counterattack was systematically dismantled before it ever crossed the line of departure. The German officers who witnessed the aftermath from a distance understood exactly what had happened. They recognized the horrific efficiency of the synchronized strike. They could see the consequences of the invisible American system clearly. Yet, for the remainder of the war, the German military never replicated it. If the mathematics of a time-on-target strike were obvious, and the physical cannons were largely the same, why couldn't the defending army simply copy the network that was systematically destroying them? The German officers who survived the time-on-target strikes knew exactly how the math worked. The concept of synchronized artillery was not a classified secret. The barrier that prevented the opposing army from copying the fire direction center was not intellectual. It was entirely industrial and cultural. To build the American system, an army could not just rewrite a manual. It needed an endless, invisible river of logistics. A centralized FDC required a front line saturated with frequency modulation radios, yet the scattered guns were striking with the speed, precision, and reflexes of a single sniper. That meant manufacturing tens of thousands of delicate vacuum tubes, precision-cut quartz crystals, and heavy waterproof batteries, then delivering them across an ocean. It required hundreds of miles of insulated copper wire to link the canvas tents to the gun pits. By the winter of 1945, the German war economy was starving. They were rationing artillery shells to single digits per day and substituting inferior steel for telephone wire because they had exhausted their copper. They simply did not have the material to build the nervous system. But the most insurmountable barrier was trust. The traditional European military doctrines centralized destructive power in the hands of senior commanders. The American FDC system inverted that pyramid. It handed the trigger for an entire division's artillery to a 22-year-old lieutenant shivering in a muddy foxhole. It handed the vital mathematical calculations to 19-year-old enlisted men, trusting that high school graduates with plastic scales and grease pencils could process targeting data faster than a colonel with a slide rule. That was the true nature of the weapon that crossed the Ruhr and the Rhine. When the German observer in his concrete pillbox watched the American Barrage effortlessly shift from a blinding smokescreen to direct suppression and finally to bridgehead defense, he believed he was witnessing an impossible artillery schedule. To understand how an entire army's artillery could fight with one mind, we first have to look at the terrifying geometry of the obstacle. He was actually watching an industrialized network reacting in real time. The cannons were old. The system controlling them was the future. The ability to coordinate a complex, multi-layered battle plan across miles of dispersed guns was not achieved by better steel, but by better communication. Yet, for all its abstract mathematics and analog computers, the system was never a clean, detached machine. The Fire Direction Center could process numbers in seconds, but it was utterly blind without the men who bled to feed it data. The invisible network rested entirely on the shoulders of the vulnerable. It required forward observers to raise their heads above the mud of a contested riverbank while everyone else was taking cover. It demanded that radio operators walk through machine gun fire, with a tall, swaying antenna painting a target on their backs. It relied on exhausted artillery crews hauling 95-pound projectiles out of the freezing mud, hour after hour, until their hands bled. And when the radios failed, it fell to unnamed wiremen, crawling through the dark under mortar fire, running their bare hands along the freezing ground to find and splice the severed ends of a copper cable. The coordinated curtain of fire that saved the infantry on the water was not a miracle. It was simply a voice transmitted through a wet black handset. They were trying to cross. We must understand why the river itself made the old rules of artillery obsolete. A plastic ruler sliding across a map in a canvas tent, and a tired gunner pulling a lanyard in the cold. A river on a military map looks like a simple blue ribbon. To an infantry platoon tasked with crossing it, it is a frictionless void. It strips away the two fundamental instincts that keep a soldier alive in combat: the ability to find cover and the ability to maneuver. When an infantryman takes fire on solid ground, his first reaction is to drop. He uses the earth. He crawls behind a stone wall, a fallen tree, or into a shallow depression. If a machine gun blocks his path, rushing past at nearly 6 miles per hour. For the past 45 minutes, the horizon across the water had been a continuous sheet of artificial lightning. His squad flanks it, moving through the dead space the enemy gunner cannot see. In an assault boat in the middle of a swollen river, there is no dead space. There is no earth to dig into. The plywood and canvas sides of the craft offer zero ballistic protection. They cannot stop a rifle bullet, let alone a burst of heavy machine gun fire. The boat is entirely exposed, silhouetted against the flat surface of the water. It moves at an agonizingly slow pace, fighting the unpredictable tug of the current. The men inside cannot run. They can only sit shoulder to shoulder, listening to the water slap against the hull, waiting to reach the far bank. The defending army understands this terrifying math. Long before the first attacker arrives, the defender shapes the battlefield. Defending engineers measure exact distances from their concealed bunkers to the water's edge. Mortar crews register their weapons to drop shells on precise grid coordinates, the exact stretches of the river where the current is strongest and the boats will be slowest. Machine gunners interlock their fields of fire, so that the water becomes a geometric grid of overlapping lead. This complete lack of friction for the defender, paired with the absolute exposure of the attacker, the American preparatory barrage was hammering the German trench lines, collapsing bunkers, and severing telephone wires. It was deafening, terrifying, and entirely predictable, is why military academies taught that a contested river crossing was the most lethal operation in ground warfare. The defender does not need to aim carefully. They only need to wait out the preliminary bombardment, emerge from their reinforced dugouts, and unleash fire into the killing zone. To survive this geographical nightmare, the attacking infantry needed artillery, but they needed artillery to perform a task it was never meant to do. Historically, a heavy barrage was a blunt, scheduled event. It was a sledgehammer swung blind. Artillery commanders would lay out a massive grid on a map, assign hundreds of guns to pulverize that area for a set duration, and then abruptly cease fire. That sudden silence was the signal for the infantry to advance, but a river crossing cannot survive a blind sledgehammer. The moment the guns went silent, the surviving defenders would emerge and sweep the river. If the artillery kept firing blindly to keep the defenders pinned, they risked dropping high explosives directly onto their own fragile, drifting assault craft. What the infantry desperately needed was a living, breathing shield. They needed an artillery screen that could walk across the water alongside them. They needed a system that could instantly drop smoke. The German observer was not panicking. He was simply waiting for the silence. He knew the rigid laws of 20th century artillery: to blind a specific, newly discovered pillbox, then pivot within seconds to crush a hidden mortar pit, and finally build a tight protective wall of shrapnel around the first vulnerable troops scrambling onto the muddy shore. The problem was not a lack of firepower. It was a disconnect of space and time. The massive howitzers capable of firing those shells were miles away, dug into ravines and camouflaged beneath netting in the rear. The infantry were the only ones who knew exactly where the fire was needed. But how could a man pinned down in the mud of a riverbank command a battery of heavy guns 3 miles away and do it fast enough to keep his men alive? A 105mm howitzer sitting in a muddy field 3 miles behind the front line is a heavy, blind piece of industrial machinery. Its crew cannot see the enemy. They cannot see the river. They only see the steel breech of their weapon, the elevation dials, and the sky. A cannon does not point and shoot. It relies on a complex mathematical equation to throw a 33-pound high-explosive shell in a massive parabolic arc over hills and forests to land on a target the size of a garage. Solving that equation is not simple. Heavy guns were blunt, strategic instruments. They fired according to complex, pre-calculated timetables drawn up by staff officers days in advance. It requires calculating the exact geographic distance between the gun and the target. But distance is only the baseline. The math must account for the temperature of the propellant powder, the wear on the rifling inside the barrel, the barometric pressure of the air, and the shifting direction of the wind at different altitudes. Under the traditional artillery doctrines developed during the First World War and maintained by many European armies, this mathematics created a severe bottleneck. The system was tightly bound to the battery commander. He was the sole authority and the sole calculator for a group of 4 guns. The commander would establish an observation post on a hill, spot a target through his binoculars, consult his paper firing tables, calculate the geometry, and send the required elevation and deflection down to his specific guns via field telephone. His 4 howitzers were permanently chained to his personal line of sight. If a target moved into a valley or behind a forest where the commander could not see it, his battery was useless. This rigid structure made emergency support for advancing infantry agonizingly slow. If an infantry squad unexpectedly ran into a fortified bunker during a patrol, they could not simply call down an artillery strike. Their plea for help had to climb a bureaucratic ladder. The American infantry on the far shore could not cross under this storm of steel. The moment they pushed their wooden assault boats into the freezing current, the request moved by runner or fragile wire from the squad, up to the company, to the infantry battalion, across to an artillery liaison officer, and finally down to an available artillery battery. Only then would a battery commander begin his calculations. He had to locate the infantry on his map based on a second-hand report, figure out where the enemy bunker was, in relation to them, and calculate the firing data from scratch using a slide rule. This process took hours. By the time the first shell left the tube, the infantrymen were either overrun or the German guns had long since relocated. Massing fire was even more difficult. If a heavy target required more than 4 guns to destroy, multiple battery commanders in completely different geographic locations had to calculate their own unique mathematical solutions. Coordinating them to fire at the exact same moment required days of meticulous staff planning. This is why the scheduled preliminary barrage was the standard tool of war. It was the only way to manage the math. But a contested river crossing like the Ruhr could not survive on days-old math. The infantry bleeding in the canvas boats needed heavy explosive, delivered to newly discovered targets in a matter of seconds. The American army crossing the water did not possess a revolutionary type of cannon. The American guns would have to lift their fire and shift it deep into the German rear. If they did not, their howitzers were entirely conventional. The physical limits of steel and cordite had not changed. If the guns themselves were the same, the only way to deliver that shifting, protective curtain of fire was to dismantle the entire mathematical bottleneck. The artillery needed a way to sever the guns from the battery commander's rigid line of sight. They needed to place the eyes of the artillery directly into the boats, and they needed a way for a single voice in the mud to command the guns. The solution began with a single man stepping into the wooden assault boat alongside the infantry. He wore the same wet olive drab, carried the same rifle, and faced the same plunging machine gun fire. But his primary weapon was strapped to the back of the soldier crouching next to him. He was a forward observer, a junior artillery lieutenant permanently embedded within the frontline rifle company. He went exactly where the infantry went. In previous wars, an observer moving with the vanguard had to unspool miles of fragile copper telephone wire behind him. A single mortar strike or the treads of a passing vehicle could sever the line, leaving the observer mute and the infantry stranded. The American system discarded the physical wire. The radio man beside the lieutenant carried a 35-pound backpack transceiver. They would blow their own assault force to pieces. That mandatory silence was the cornerstone of the German defense. Crucially, these tactical radios operated on frequency modulation. Unlike older equipment, FM signals cut cleanly through the electrical interference of thunderstorms, the engine whine of trucks, and the heavy atmospheric static of the battlefield. It delivered a crisp, recognizable human voice across miles of contested terrain. The tall, flexible whip antenna swaying above the radio man made the team a priority target for German snipers, who knew that killing the observer meant blinding the American guns. But the risk was the price of the system. The radio was the lifeline. As the assault boat hit the eastern bank of the Ruhr and the infantry scrambled up the muddy slope, the forward observer pushed into the dirt with them. When a concealed German pillbox opened fire and pinned the platoon against the freezing water, the infantry did not have to send a runner back across the lethal river to beg for heavy support. The observer simply crawled into a shallow depression, took the heavy black handset, and pressed the transmit button. The new American artillery doctrine had fundamentally changed his job by stripping away the mathematics. A man taking fire in the mud cannot accurately calculate wind velocity, barometric pressure, or the parabolic trajectory of a 33-pound high-explosive shell. He was no longer expected to act as a mathematician. He was entirely a sensor. His only responsibility was to read the physical terrain,